The fastest way to discover who people really are is to let them believe you have nothing they want. Crimson wine spread across Malcolm Carter's charcoal gray suit as the crystal glass slipped from his wife's hand and shattered against the polished marble floor of the grand ballroom. Hundreds of guests froze beneath the golden chandeliers while a string quartet abruptly stopped playing. Danielle Carter did not look surprised. She looked embarrassed that her husband was still standing beside her. Before Malcolm could even reach for a napkin, his mother-in-law, Gloria Hayes, shook her head with open disappointment. "I told you this would happen," she said loudly enough for nearby executives to hear. "Some people simply do not belong in rooms like this." Soft laughter rippled through the crowd. Malcolm looked down at the deep red stain soaking into the front of his jacket before slowly lifting his eyes. He did not argue. He did not defend himself. He simply reached into his pocket for a folded handkerchief, quietly wiping a drop of wine from his wrist, as though protecting his dignity mattered more than protecting his pride. Across the ballroom, an elderly gentleman in an impeccably tailored tuxedo had just stepped through the entrance, surrounded by several attorneys and corporate board members. The moment his eyes settled on Malcolm, his expression changed from polite curiosity to unmistakable shock. He took one step forward before stopping completely, unable to look away. Malcolm never noticed him. Neither did Danielle or Gloria. They were far too busy worrying about what everyone else thought. 7 days earlier, Malcolm had been standing inside the small woodworking studio he owned on the outskirts of Atlanta. The familiar scent of cedar and walnut filled the air while sunlight streamed through tall workshop windows, catching tiny particles of sawdust floating above a handcrafted dining table. Malcolm carefully sanded the final edge until it felt perfectly smooth beneath his fingertips. He smiled quietly, satisfied with honest work that rarely earned headlines but always earned gratitude from his customers. His phone buzzed across the workbench. "Danielle." He answered immediately. "Hey." Her voice sounded rushed. "Do not forget next Friday." Malcolm frowned slightly. "What is next Friday?" "The Whitmore Foundation Gala. I told you about it twice already." Malcolm glanced at the calendar hanging beside his tool cabinet. "Right. I remember now." Danielle sighed. "Please tell me you are not planning to wear that old navy suit again." Malcolm looked toward the garment bag hanging inside the office. "It is still in good condition." "That is not what I asked." He smiled gently even though she could not see it. "It still fits." Danielle remained silent for several seconds before speaking again. "Everyone important in the city will be there. Investors, business owners, politicians. I cannot spend the whole evening explaining why my husband refuses to look successful." Malcolm rested one hand against the unfinished table. "I thought the gala was about raising money for scholarships. It is also about making connections." Her tone became firmer. "Please, Malcolm, just this once, try to look like someone who belongs." After the call ended, Malcolm stood quietly in the workshop. He glanced at his worn leather wallet, his old silver watch, and the simple brass key hanging from a faded chain around his neck, a keepsake given to him by the couple who had raised him. He slipped the key back beneath his shirt and returned to sanding the table, without realizing that the ordinary object he had carried every day since childhood would soon make an entire ballroom question everything they believed they knew about the man standing in front of them. The week passed quickly, but Danielle treated every day leading up to the gala like a countdown to an important audition. Every evening, she reminded Malcolm about the guest list, the dress code, and the influential people expected to attend. By Thursday night, their dining table had disappeared beneath fashion magazines, invitation cards, and photographs from previous charity galas. Danielle pointed toward one picture after another. "Look at these couples. Every husband understands the assignment. They know how to present themselves." Malcolm studied the photographs before quietly setting them aside. "They also look like they forgot how to smile." Danielle rolled her eyes. "This is exactly why you never fit into these events." Malcolm did not answer. Instead, he carried his empty coffee mug to the kitchen sink and rinsed it beneath warm water. He had learned long ago that not every disagreement deserved another argument. The following afternoon, he closed his woodworking shop an hour earlier than usual. Before locking the front door, he walked slowly through the workshop, making sure every machine had been turned off and every unfinished project had been covered. Daniel, his longtime employee, noticed Malcolm looking unusually thoughtful. "Big night?" he asked with a grin. Malcolm nodded. "Apparently." Daniel leaned against the workbench. You look more nervous than when you delivered that 20-foot conference table to City Hall. Malcolm laughed softly. I am not nervous about the event. I am just hoping everyone gets through the evening without trying to become someone they are not. Daniel smiled. That has always been your strength. Do not lose it because somebody else wants a different version of you. Malcolm thanked him before heading home. An hour later, he stepped into the bedroom, carrying the navy suit Danielle had criticized only days before. It had been professionally cleaned, carefully pressed, and hung neatly inside a garment bag. He slipped it on, adjusted the collar, and fastened the old silver watch his adoptive father had given him on his 21st birthday. Finally, he reached beneath his shirt and touched the small brass key resting against his chest. He had worn it every day for as long as he could remember. His adoptive mother once told him it had been found around his neck when he arrived at their home as an infant. She never knew where it came from, only that she believed it might matter one day. Malcolm had stopped wondering about its origin years ago. To him, it represented love, not mystery. Danielle walked into the room wearing an elegant emerald gown and immediately noticed his outfit. She stared at him for several seconds before letting out a disappointed sigh. You actually wore it. Malcolm looked down. It is clean. It fits well. I thought it looked fine. Danielle picked up a silk tie from the dresser and handed it to him. You always settle for fine when everyone else aims for exceptional. Before Malcolm could respond, the front door opened and Gloria Hayes entered carrying a designer handbag and a garment cover. She looked Malcolm up and down without hiding her opinion. That suit again? She asked. Danielle folded her arms. I tried. Gloria shook her head. No wonder people underestimate you. Malcolm calmly picked up his car keys. I did not realize clothing determined character. Gloria smiled without warmth. It determines first impressions, and first impressions open doors. Malcolm held the front door open for both women without another word. As they drove toward downtown Atlanta beneath the glow of the city skyline, Danielle adjusted her earrings while Gloria reviewed the names of wealthy donors expected to attend. Malcolm kept both hands on the steering wheel, listening quietly as they discussed powerful families, successful entrepreneurs, and billionaire executives, completely unaware that before the evening was over, every conversation inside that grand ballroom would revolve around the quiet man they had spent the entire drive pretending did not belong there. The entrance to the Whitmore Foundation Gala shimmered beneath towering crystal chandeliers as luxury sedans lined the circular driveway outside the historic hotel. Uniformed attendants welcomed guests dressed in tailored tuxedos and elegant evening gowns, while photographers captured smiling couples against a wall decorated with white roses and gold lettering. Malcolm stepped from the car first and walked around to open Danielle's door before offering the same courtesy to Gloria. Neither woman thanked him. Danielle adjusted the diamond necklace resting against her emerald dress before glancing toward Malcolm with visible concern. Please remember, she whispered. Try not to say too much tonight. Malcolm smiled politely. I usually find listening more interesting anyway. Gloria overheard the exchange and shook her head. Listening is fine. Just do not embarrass us. Together they entered the grand ballroom, where soft piano music drifted through the air and waiters moved gracefully between guests carrying silver trays filled with sparkling water, fruit juice, and glasses of red and white wine. Malcolm admired the architecture more than the crowd. The painted ceilings, polished marble columns, and handcrafted wood details reminded him of the buildings he loved restoring. Every carved railing and decorative panel represented countless hours of patient craftsmanship. Danielle noticed him studying the room instead of introducing himself to influential guests. You are looking at the walls? She asked with disbelief. Malcolm nodded. The woodworking is incredible. Someone put years of skill into this place. Danielle sighed quietly. Successful people are standing 10 feet away, and you are complimenting the staircase. Before Malcolm could answer, Gloria gently touched Danielle's arm and pointed toward a group of executives gathered near the center of the ballroom. There they are, she whispered excitedly. Members of the Whitmore board. Danielle immediately smiled and walked toward them, expecting Malcolm to follow. He did, but only after returning an elderly server's dropped napkin and thanking him for his hard work. The simple exchange went unnoticed by Danielle, but another guest quietly observed it from across the room with thoughtful eyes. Danielle introduced herself confidently to several business leaders, carefully mentioning her position at a marketing firm while subtly avoiding conversation about Malcolm. When one executive politely asked, "And what line of work are you in, sir?" Malcolm answered honestly, "I own a small woodworking business outside Atlanta. We build custom furniture and restore historic pieces." The executive smiled with genuine interest. "That sounds fascinating." Before he could ask another question, Gloria stepped forward with an awkward laugh. "He is being modest. It is a very small shop." Danielle quickly changed the subject, directing the conversation toward investment trends instead. Malcolm quietly stepped aside, allowing them to continue without interruption. He accepted a glass of sparkling water from a passing waiter and wandered toward a display showcasing scholarship recipients whose education had been funded by the foundation. He paused to read each student's story carefully, smiling as he imagined the opportunities waiting for them. Across the ballroom, Danielle watched him standing alone. Instead of feeling sympathy, she felt embarrassment. "Look at him," she muttered to Gloria. "He belongs at the scholarship display instead of talking to donors." Gloria followed her gaze and frowned. "He has no sense of how these events work." Just then another waiter approached Malcolm carrying a tray of red wine. Malcolm reached for a glass only after making sure the waiter had regained his balance while navigating through the crowded ballroom. Danielle saw the moment from across the room, exchanged a meaningful glance with Gloria, and without another word both women began walking directly toward Malcolm, convinced that before the evening ended they would finally teach him the lesson they believed he had refused to learn. Malcolm accepted the glass of red wine with a grateful smile before stepping aside to avoid blocking the scholarship display. He continued reading the stories mounted on polished wooden panels, pausing in front of a photograph of a young engineering student whose tuition had been funded by the foundation. "That is what tonight should really be about," he quietly said to the elderly waiter standing beside him. The waiter smiled warmly. "Not many guests stop long enough to read those." Malcolm nodded. "People's futures deserve more attention than fancy decorations." The waiter thanked him and continued through the ballroom. At that same moment, Danielle and Gloria approached together with determined expressions. Danielle glanced around to make sure several prominent guests were within earshot before forcing a polite smile. "Malcolm," she called. He turned immediately. "Everything all right?" Danielle looked at the wine glass in his hand and then at the group of executives only a few feet away. "Actually, no. We need to talk." Malcolm could already sense the tension in her voice, but he remained calm. "Of course." Gloria folded her arms. "Do you realize you have spent almost the entire evening talking to servers and reading scholarship displays instead of introducing yourself to people who matter?" Malcolm answered without raising his voice. "The students matter. The staff matter too." Danielle sighed in frustration. "You still do not understand. This evening is about opportunities." Malcolm smiled gently. "Helping those students seems like a worthwhile opportunity." A nearby couple exchanged curious glances after overhearing the conversation. Danielle noticed them watching, and her embarrassment quickly turned into irritation. "You always do this," she whispered sharply. "You refuse to think bigger." Malcolm looked genuinely confused. "I thought we came here to support education." Gloria stepped closer. "We came here because successful people build relationships with successful people." Malcolm looked from Gloria to Danielle before answering. "Respectfully, I believe successful people should know how to treat everyone with respect first." The words landed harder than anyone expected. Several guests quietly stopped talking. Danielle felt every pair of nearby eyes drifting toward them. Her face flushed with frustration. Without thinking, she reached toward Malcolm's hand as though trying to take the wine glass away before he embarrassed her again. The movement was quick and careless. The glass slipped sideways, sending a wave of deep red wine across the front of Malcolm's charcoal gray jacket before falling to the marble floor with a sharp crack that echoed through the ballroom. Silence replaced every conversation. Danielle stared at the spreading stain across Malcolm's suit for only a heartbeat before taking a small step backward. Instead of apologizing, she shook her head. "This is exactly why I begged you not to wear that old suit." Gloria looked around at the watching crowd and added loudly, "Some people simply cannot learn how to fit into this world." A few uncomfortable laughs drifted through the room while others remained silent, uncertain whether they had just witnessed an accident or something far more deliberate. Malcolm slowly looked down at the wine soaking into the fabric before removing the folded white handkerchief from his pocket. He carefully wiped a drop from his wrist without showing anger or humiliation. "It is only a suit," he said quietly. "It can be cleaned." Across the ballroom, the main entrance opened once again. An elderly gentleman with silver hair entered beside several attorneys and members of the Whitmore Foundation Board. He had greeted dozens of guests with polite smiles that evening, but the moment his eyes fell upon Malcolm, every trace of that practiced expression disappeared. His attention was not fixed on the stained jacket. It was locked on the old brass key that had slipped free from beneath Malcolm's shirt and now rested against the front of his wine-soaked suit. The gentleman stopped walking immediately, his breathing caught in stunned disbelief, before quietly whispering words that nobody standing beside him could understand. The whisper from the silver-haired gentleman was almost lost beneath the silence that had settled over the ballroom, yet the urgency in his voice immediately caught the attention of everyone walking beside him. "Stop," he said firmly. "Do not move another step." The attorneys and board members slowed without question as the elderly man continued staring at Malcolm from across the room. His eyes never left the small brass key resting against the stained jacket. Malcolm had already tucked his handkerchief back into his pocket and was preparing to excuse himself to clean the wine from his suit when he noticed the distinguished stranger approaching. Every conversation inside the ballroom faded into a quiet murmur. Danielle leaned toward Gloria. "Who is that?" Gloria's face turned pale. "That is Harold Whitmore." Danielle swallowed hard. Even she recognized the name. Harold Whitmore had built one of the largest private investment groups in the country and rarely appeared in public despite serving as honorary chairman of the foundation. People did not approach him. They waited for him to approach them. Yet now he walked directly toward Malcolm with an expression no one present had ever seen before. Harold stopped only a few feet away. For several seconds, he simply looked at the brass key hanging from Malcolm's neck as though he were seeing a memory brought back to life. Finally, he spoke. "Young man, may I ask where you got that key?" Malcolm instinctively touched the small pendant. "I have had it for as long as I can remember." Harold's voice remained calm, but his hands trembled slightly. "Who gave it to you?" Malcolm answered honestly. "The couple who raised me told me it was around my neck when they adopted me as an infant. They never knew where it came from, so I kept wearing it." Harold slowly closed his eyes before opening them again. One of the attorneys standing behind him exchanged a surprised glance with another board member. Harold reached into the inside pocket of his tuxedo and carefully removed an old leather wallet. From it, he unfolded a faded photograph that had clearly been carried for many years. He held it beside the brass key without saying a word. The design engraved into the tiny metal surface matched the symbol visible in the photograph perfectly. Malcolm frowned in confusion. "What is this?" Harold looked at him with unmistakable emotion. "A family crest." Danielle stepped forward with an uneasy laugh. "There must be some misunderstanding. My husband has owned a woodworking shop his entire life." Harold turned toward her politely. "Young lady, I have spent more than 3 decades searching for someone connected to that crest." The ballroom fell completely silent. Gloria tried to interrupt. "Surely many copies could have been made." Harold slowly shook his head. "No, only one original key was ever commissioned. It was created by my father and placed around the neck of my grandson on the day he was born." Malcolm stared at him without speaking. The words seemed impossible to understand. "Grandson?" he repeated quietly. Harold nodded. "The child disappeared during a tragic accident many years ago. Despite every investigation, every search, and every private investigator we hired, we never found him." Malcolm instinctively looked down at the key resting in his hand before lifting his eyes again. "Sir, I think you have mistaken me for someone else." Harold took one slow breath before answering. "I sincerely hope I have not, because if I am right, then tonight is not the end of a misunderstanding. It is the beginning of the truth we have been searching for longer than you have been alive." At that exact moment, one of Harold's senior attorneys quietly stepped forward carrying a sealed leather document case, his expression making it unmistakably clear that he already knew what Harold intended to do next. The attorney carefully placed the worn leather document case on a nearby table before unlocking 2 polished brass clasps with deliberate precision. Every guest within sight instinctively leaned closer, sensing that the atmosphere inside the ballroom had changed forever. Malcolm remained motionless, still trying to understand how an ordinary keepsake from his childhood had suddenly become the center of everyone's attention. Harold Whitmore nodded to his attorney, who removed several age documents protected inside transparent sleeves. These records have remained sealed for more than 30 years, the attorney explained calmly. Mr. Whitmore instructed our firm that they would only be opened if convincing evidence of his missing grandson's identity was ever discovered. Danielle exchanged a nervous glance with Gloria, but neither woman spoke. Harold picked up the first document with careful hands. When my grandson was born, our family commissioned 2 unique items, he said. The first was this engraved brass key. The second was a matching registry identifying the child who carried it. He handed the paper to the attorney, who compared the engraved symbol on the key hanging from Malcolm's neck with the illustration printed on the aging certificate. Every line matched perfectly. The attorney looked up slowly. The engraving is identical. A quiet wave of disbelief spread through the ballroom. Malcolm shook his head gently. There has to be another explanation. Harold smiled with kindness instead of certainty. That is exactly why we prepared more than one form of proof. The attorney removed another envelope and unfolded several photographs taken decades earlier. One showed Harold's late son holding a newborn infant wearing the same brass key around his neck. Another displayed the handcrafted wooden cradle that had been commissioned by the family. Malcolm stared at the cradle in silence. Something about the carved pattern along its side felt strangely familiar, though he could not explain why. Harold noticed the expression on Malcolm's face. Do you recognize it? Malcolm hesitated before answering. When I was growing up, my adoptive mother kept a small wooden music box inside our living room. It had the exact same carving. Harold slowly closed his eyes as emotion crossed his face. My wife carved that pattern herself. She believed it would become our family signature. The attorney immediately looked toward Malcolm. Would your adoptive parents still have that music box? Malcolm nodded slowly. I believe they do. The attorney smiled for the first time. That would provide another direct connection. Danielle could no longer remain silent. This cannot be happening because of an old key and a few photographs. Harold turned toward her with remarkable composure. Young lady, those are only the beginning. He nodded once more toward his attorney, who removed a final document bearing multiple official seals. This statement was prepared by the family's legal office years ago, the attorney announced. It declares that should the missing heir ever be found and properly identified, every succession plan would immediately be restored according to the original family trust. Murmurs swept through the room. Several executives looked at Malcolm with entirely different expressions than they had only minutes before. The same people who had barely acknowledged him now studied every word he spoke and every movement he made. Malcolm noticed the sudden change and quietly frowned. Please, he said, do not look at me differently because of documents you have only just seen. I am still the same man who walked into this room an hour ago. Harold's eyes filled with admiration. That answer, he replied softly, is exactly what convinces me more than any legal paper ever could that you truly belong to this family. As those words settled over the silent ballroom, Danielle slowly realized that the respect she had spent years chasing had just been freely given to the husband she had spent the entire evening trying to hide. The ballroom remained silent for several long seconds before Harold Whitmore slowly turned toward the guests gathered around him. His voice was calm, yet every word carried the quiet confidence of a man who had spent decades waiting for this moment. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, many of you have worked beside me for years. Some of you have known my family's story. Others have only heard rumors. Tonight I can finally tell you that hope was not misplaced. Every eye shifted toward Malcolm, who still looked overwhelmed by everything unfolding around him. Harold continued, 34 years ago, my son and daughter-in-law were involved in a tragic accident while traveling with their infant son. Rescue teams believed the child had been lost forever. We searched every hospital, every foster agency, every adoption record that could legally be accessed. We never stopped looking. The attorney quietly nodded. Every investigation remained open under Mr. Whitmore's instructions. Harold looked back at Malcolm with unmistakable warmth. It appears that kindness accomplished what money never could. A loving family raised you, protected you, and gave you the values that no inheritance could ever purchase. Malcolm lowered his eyes for a moment. If they had not found me, I would not be standing here today. Harold smiled. Then I hope I will someday have the honor of thanking them personally. Those words immediately transformed the atmosphere inside the ballroom. The executives who had ignored Malcolm earlier now approached one after another, offering handshakes, respectful greetings, and sincere congratulations. Malcolm accepted each gesture politely, but his expression remained unchanged. He neither celebrated nor boasted. Danielle watched the scene unfold with growing disbelief. Only an hour earlier, those same people had barely acknowledged her husband. Now they waited patiently for the opportunity to introduce themselves. Gloria stood speechless, unable to reconcile the quiet woodworker she had dismissed with the man everyone suddenly treated with extraordinary respect. One board member smiled at Malcolm. "Mr. Whitmore, welcome home." Malcolm gently shook his head. "Please call me Malcolm. I have been Malcolm my entire life." The board member smiled even wider. "That humility explains everything." Harold quietly laughed. "You are already teaching this room an important lesson." He then gestured toward the scholarship display where Malcolm had been standing before the incident. "Tell everyone what you were looking at when I walked in." Malcolm seemed surprised by the request. "The scholarship stories," he answered honestly. "I wanted to know who the students were because they are the reason this event exists." Harold slowly faced the guests again. "Did you hear that?" Before anyone recognized his name, before anyone believed he belonged here, he cared more about the scholarship recipients than about meeting wealthy donors. Several guests lowered their eyes with visible embarrassment. Harold continued, "Character reveals itself long before status does." Applause began softly near the front of the ballroom before spreading throughout the hall. Malcolm looked uncomfortable with the attention and quietly raised one hand. "I appreciate your kindness, but nothing about me changed tonight. The only thing that changed was what everyone believed about me." His words settled heavily over the crowd. Danielle felt each sentence like a mirror reflecting every dismissive comment she had made throughout their marriage. She remembered criticizing his clothes, his business, his quiet nature, and his simple values. Yet those very qualities were now earning admiration from people she had spent years trying to impress. Harold stepped beside Malcolm and placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Our family lost an heir many years ago," he said. "Tonight we found something far greater. We found a man who became honorable without wealth, successful without privilege, and respected without demanding recognition." The applause grew even louder as Malcolm stood quietly beneath the crystal chandeliers, still wearing the same wine-stained suit that only moments earlier had made so many people believe he did not belong. As the applause gradually faded, the atmosphere inside the ballroom shifted from surprise to admiration. Guests who had once measured Malcolm by the cut of his suit now spoke about his integrity, his quiet confidence, and the humility that could not be purchased with money. Harold Whitmore politely excused himself to greet several board members, leaving Malcolm standing alone for the first time since the revelation. He took a slow breath, still trying to process everything that had happened within the past few minutes. He looked down at the familiar brass key resting against his chest. It felt exactly the same as it had that morning, even though the world around him had changed completely. Danielle slowly approached him, her confident posture replaced by hesitation. For a moment, she simply stood there, unsure how to begin. "Malcolm," she said softly, "can we talk?" He turned toward her with the same calm expression he had worn all evening. "Of course." Danielle lowered her eyes. "I owe you an apology." Malcolm remained silent, allowing her to continue. "I spent years believing success was something people could see from the outside. I cared too much about appearances, about expensive events, about what strangers thought. I convinced myself that if you looked more successful, people would respect us more." She paused as emotion caught in her voice. "I never realized that I was the one failing to see your worth." Malcolm listened without interrupting. Across the room, Gloria watched anxiously, uncertain whether to join them. Danielle continued, "When the wine spilled on your suit, I should have defended you. Instead, I cared more about my own embarrassment than about the man who has always stood beside me." Malcolm looked at the stain that remained across his jacket before answering quietly. "The wine did not embarrass me, Danielle." She looked up hopefully. "Then what did?" He met her eyes with gentle honesty. "Realizing that my own wife believed I was something she needed to apologize for." Danielle's shoulders dropped as tears gathered in her eyes. She understood that his words were not spoken in anger. They were spoken with disappointment, and somehow that hurt even more. Gloria finally walked toward them, her voice lacking the certainty she usually carried. "Malcolm," she began, "I judged you unfairly. I thought I was encouraging my daughter to seek a better future, but I confused wealth with character. I was wrong." Malcolm nodded respectfully. "Thank you for saying that." Gloria looked genuinely ashamed. "Can you forgive us?" Malcolm remained quiet for several moments before answering. Forgiveness and trust are not always restored at the same speed. Neither woman argued because they knew he was right. Harold returned just then, carrying a fresh jacket that one of the hotel managers had provided. "I thought you might like something more comfortable," he said with a warm smile. Malcolm accepted it gratefully. "Thank you, but this stained suit has reminded me of something important." Harold raised an eyebrow. Malcolm smiled gently. "The people who respected me before they knew the truth are the ones whose opinions matter most." Harold looked around the ballroom before nodding with admiration. "Then you have already learned the lesson that took many people in this room an entire lifetime." Danielle quietly reached toward Malcolm's hand, but stopped before touching it, uncertain whether she still had that right. Malcolm noticed the hesitation but did not move closer. The distance between them was no longer measured in inches. It had been built over years of overlooked kindness, quiet sacrifices, and words that could never be taken back. As the orchestra began playing once again, and conversations slowly returned throughout the ballroom, Danielle finally understood that discovering Malcolm's true identity had been far easier than earning back the respect she had so carelessly allowed herself to lose. 3 months later, the headlines surrounding the Whitmore family had faded, but the lessons from that unforgettable evening continued to shape every life it had touched. Malcolm stood inside his woodworking shop, wearing a simple denim work shirt with sawdust resting on his sleeves as sunlight streamed through the familiar windows. The expensive tailored suits that now filled one section of his closet had not replaced the workbench where he still spent hours creating furniture with his own hands. Harold Whitmore entered the shop carrying 2 cups of coffee and smiled as he watched Malcolm carefully sand the edge of a handcrafted dining table. "I had a feeling I would find you here," Harold said. Malcolm accepted the coffee with a grateful smile. "Some things are worth keeping exactly the way they have always been." Harold nodded. "The board keeps asking when you plan to move into the executive office." Malcolm chuckled softly. "Wood dust feels more comfortable than polished marble." Harold laughed before looking around the workshop with admiration. "I spent my entire career building companies. You remind me that building something with your own hands carries a different kind of wealth." During the weeks that followed the gala, Malcolm completed every legal process necessary to confirm his identity as Harold's grandson and rightful heir. Yet the first major decision he made surprised everyone. Rather than expanding the family's investment portfolio, he directed a significant portion of the foundation's resources toward vocational education, trade schools, woodworking programs, and scholarships for students whose talents were often overlooked because they did not follow traditional career paths. "Opportunity should never depend on someone's last name," Malcolm explained during his first board meeting. "It should depend on character and determination." The proposal passed with unanimous support. Danielle watched those changes from a distance. After the gala, she had moved into a small apartment across town, giving both of them the space Malcolm had quietly requested. She wrote him several letters over those months, not asking for another chance, but acknowledging every moment she wished she had handled differently. Malcolm read each letter carefully. He appreciated her honesty, but he understood that sincere regret could not erase years of misplaced priorities overnight. One afternoon, Danielle visited the woodworking shop carrying a small box. "I found this while cleaning the house," she said. Inside rested the old silver watch Malcolm's adoptive father had given him years earlier. Malcolm smiled warmly as he lifted it into his hand. "Thank you for bringing it." Danielle nodded. "I finally understand why you treasured this more than expensive things." Malcolm looked at the worn leather strap before answering. "Because love gives ordinary objects extraordinary value." Danielle smiled sadly. "I wish I had understood that sooner." Malcolm looked at her with kindness rather than resentment. "I hope you do not spend your life regretting the past. I hope you spend it becoming the person you wanted me to become." Tears filled her eyes as she quietly thanked him before walking away with a peace she had not carried in months. Later that evening, Malcolm visited the modest home where his adoptive parents still lived. Harold accompanied him, carrying flowers and gratitude instead of formal introductions. The two families sat together around a simple wooden dinner table, sharing stories, laughter, and memories that had been separated by circumstance but united through love. Harold stood before leaving and looked at Malcolm with unmistakable pride. "For many years I believed I had lost my family's future," he said. "Now I realize it was never lost. It was simply being raised by the right people." Malcolm glanced at the brass key resting beside his old silver watch and smiled quietly. The key had opened more than the door to an inheritance. It had revealed that true wealth was never measured by elegant clothing, famous names, or grand ballrooms. It was measured by humility when others offered judgment, kindness when others expected bitterness, and the courage to remain the same good man even after the entire world finally discovered who you truly were.